Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love captivating stories about men transforming into women in unique and fascinating ways, then be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Now, let's jump right into today's tale.
She took a moment to think, to let his words truly sink in, to evaluate them against what she knew of him, what she'd experienced with him. The Daniel she knew, the man who had pursued her with such focused attention, who had listened to her ideas with genuine interest, who had touched her with such care and passion, that man aligned more closely with this explanation than with her fears of manipulation or exploitation. And then, because she needed to hear it, because she needed to know, she asked, "So what now?" The question encompassed so much. What did this mean for them? Where did they go from here? How did they move forward with all these revelations between them? Whoa. She hesitated, then forced herself to continue, to voice the specific concern that still lingered despite his reassurances. The one thing that still felt vulnerable, still felt like it might be a deal breaker, despite everything else. "You know I used to be a man. Are you still okay with that?" The question felt raw, exposed, laying bare her deepest insecurity about their relationship. Because this was the crux of it, wasn't it? Not just that he had known without telling her, but that he had known this particular fact, and pursued her anyway. What did that mean for how he saw her, how he desired her? For a moment Daniel didn't say anything. His expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Kristin to catalog: surprise, confusion, something like frustration, and then finally, determination. Then, without warning, he moved. In one smooth motion, he left his seat and sat right next to her, closing the distance between them in an instant. The cushion dipped under his weight, bringing them into closer proximity than they'd been since before yesterday's revelation. Kristin barely had time to process it before he gently but firmly cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. His palms were warm against her cheeks, his touch both tender and insistent, brooking no argument or doubt. Not just a simple kiss. This wasn't a casual peck or a tentative reconnection. This was communication in its most primal form, direct, unambiguous, impossible to misinterpret. A deep, passionate, soul-stealing kiss that left no room for doubt, no room for misunderstanding. His lips moved against hers, with a combination of tenderness and hunger that made her head spin, made her forget all the carefully reasoned arguments and questions she'd prepared. It was an answer in itself, more eloquent than any words could have been, more convincing than any logical explanation or reasoned argument. His body was telling her what perhaps words had failed to convey adequately, that he wanted her, desired her, accepted her completely as she was now. It told her exactly where he stood, exactly what he wanted, exactly how he felt. There was no hesitation in the way his hands cradled her face, no reservation in how his lips claimed hers, no ambiguity in the small sound of need that escaped him when she began to respond. Kristin melted into him, her hands gripping his shirt as she kissed him back, her heart pounding for an entirely different reason now. All the tension, all the uncertainty that had been coiled inside her, began to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that spread through her body, a relief so profound it was almost dizzying. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Daniel didn't move away. He kept his hands on her face, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes holding hers with that intense focus that made her feel like the center of his universe. "Does that answer your question?" he asked softly, a hint of his usual confidence returning to his voice. "I don't know," she replied, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I think I might need a little more clarification." "Hi?" Daniel laughed, the sound rich and warm, breaking the last of the tension between them. "That," he said, pressing another brief kiss to her lips, "I can definitely provide." As he pulled her closer for another kiss, Kristin knew without a shadow of doubt that this was real. The connection between them, the desire, the growing emotional attachment. None of it had been an illusion or a game. And in that moment, she knew. Daniel wasn't going anywhere. His arms around her, his lips against hers, the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her palm, all of it spoke of permanence, of commitment, of a future neither of them had anticipated when they first met, but both now seemed unwilling to relinquish. And neither was she. Whatever complications lay ahead, and surely there would be many, given their respective magical heritages and the unusual circumstances of their meeting, they would face them together. Not as a witch and a warlock with separate traditions and separate paths, but as partners who had found something unexpected and precious in each other. As his kiss deepened, as her body responded to his with familiar heat and urgency, Kristin allowed herself to fully embrace the truth that had been there all along, beneath the fears and doubts and misunderstandings. This was where she belonged. This was who she was meant to be with. And no amount of magical transformation or family complication was going to change that fundamental reality. 5 years later, the world had changed for them. Fall painted the trees in vibrant hues of amber, crimson, and gold as Kristin and Daniel made their way up the familiar stone path to her grandmother's Victorian house. A crisp breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, stirring Kristin's auburn hair around her shoulders. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had: manicured lawns, well-maintained facades, an air of quiet affluence, and yet everything was different. 5 years ago, Kristin had been lost, trying to understand who she was, where she belonged, and what her future looked like. The transformation spell had given her a new body, a new identity, a new perspective on life. But it had been up to her to determine what to do with those gifts, how to build a life that was authentically hers. Now she stood beside Daniel, not only as his wife but as his equal. The platinum band on her left hand caught the afternoon sunlight, the intricate engravings of ancient magical symbols, visible only to those with the sight to see them. Matching the ring on Daniel's finger, it represented far more than a typical marriage. It was a magical bond, a weaving together of energies and destinies that transcended ordinary unions. "Your grandmother redecorated the front garden again," Daniel observed, nodding toward the new arrangement of mums and ornamental grasses that framed the walkway. "Those weren't here last month." "She changes it with the seasons," Kristin replied, a fond smile playing at her lips. "Though I suspect these particular flowers are more than just decorative." Daniel chuckled, recognizing the particular species his mother-in-law had selected. "Protection blooms in the north corner, clarity enhancers by the steps, and if I'm not mistaken, those white ones are fertility amplifiers." "Subtle as ever," Kristin muttered, though she couldn't suppress her grin. Grand's not-so-subtle hints about great-grandchildren had become increasingly overt over the past year, especially after Daniel's younger brother and his wife announced their first pregnancy. Their marriage had done more than just bind two souls together. It had done something unprecedented. It had united two powerful supernatural bloodlines for the first time in centuries. The Thompson witches, with their female-dominant magic and specialty in transformation and luck manipulation, joined with the Carter warlocks, wielders of male-dominant business and prosperity magic that had quietly shaped the American economy for generations. "Remember the look on my father's face at our engagement dinner?" "Ow," Daniel reminisced, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "I thought he might actually pass out when your grandmother casually mentioned that her great-great-grandmother had once hexed his great-great-grandfather." "To be fair," Kristin replied, "your ancestor did try to steal her grimoire." "He was merely borrowing it," Daniel countered with mock defensiveness. "Our family history suggests he would have returned it. Eventually." After copying all her proprietary spells, Kristin reminded him, playfully bumping her shoulder against his arm. "Your family has always had a rather flexible approach to magical intellectual property. We call it competitive research," Daniel quipped, pulling her closer against his side as they approached the front porch. Besides, it all worked out in the end. Our families are united. Our magic's complementary. And our future. He paused, his expression softening as he gazed down at her, brighter than either of us could have imagined. Their story had spread far and wide, whispered among witches and warlocks alike. Some saw them as a symbol of unity, others as a force to be reckoned with. The magical community, traditionally insular and resistant to change, had initially reacted with everything from cautious optimism to outright hostility. But over time, the undeniable power of their partnership, both magical and mundane, had silenced most critics. Daniel's business acumen combined with Kristin's design innovation had transformed Thompson Design into a powerhouse firm that attracted the most prestigious clients in the country. Meanwhile, their collaborative magical work, blending traditions and techniques previously kept separate for centuries, had produced results that even the most conservative elders couldn't ignore. "Did you hear the council is considering our proposal for a unified magical education system?" Daniel asked, as they climbed the porch steps, the wood creaking softly beneath their weight. "Grandfather Elliot must be rolling in his grave," Kristin remarked with a smirk. "Wasn't he the one who said the Thompson methods were too intuitive and undisciplined for proper magical instruction?" "The very same," Daniel confirmed. "Though, to be fair, your grandmother once described Carter's spellcasting as soulless corporate magic packaged in expensive suits." "Well, she wasn't entirely wrong," Kristin teased, eyeing his tailored charcoal sweater and designer jeans. "You do all dress exceptionally well while manipulating the financial markets." And it was true. Their combined power had only grown since they had come together. Spells that had previously been the exclusive domain of one tradition or the other now flowed seamlessly between them, enhanced and amplified by their unique bond. Rituals that once required multiple practitioners could be performed by just the two of them, their complementary energies filling in the gaps that traditionally necessitated larger circles. But today wasn't about power or the supernatural world. The weather prediction spell they'd cast that morning had confirmed optimal conditions for their news. The protective charms they'd reinforced around Gran's property ensured privacy from any magical eavesdroppers. The timing alignment spell had indicated that this afternoon was auspicious for important family announcements. Today was about family. Kristin squeezed Daniel's hand as they stood at her grandmother's front door, nerves fluttering in her stomach. Despite 5 years of marriage, countless magical breakthroughs, and the respect of the most powerful practitioners in the country, she still felt like an eager student seeking her grandmother's approval. "She already knows," Kristin murmured, half to herself. "I can feel it." "She suspects," Daniel corrected gently. "But even your grandmother can't know for certain." "We've been careful." Their precautions had been extensive, specially crafted concealment charms, misdirection spells, even the old-fashioned technique of simply not telling anyone until they were ready. They'd waited, wanting to be absolutely certain before sharing their news. He gave her a reassuring smile, as if sensing her emotions without her needing to say a word. Their connection had deepened over the years, developing into something that occasionally bordered on telepathic, especially during moments of heightened emotion. "Ready?" he asked, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in that soothing rhythm she'd come to rely on during tense moments. "As I'll ever be," Kristin replied, straightening her shoulders. "Though I'm still not convinced we shouldn't have brought backup." "Your mother would have given it away immediately," Daniel reminded her with a chuckle. "Remember how she reacted when we told her we were buying the lake house? She called everyone in her contact list before we'd even finished signing the papers." Before either of them could knock, the door swung open with that familiar theatrical timing that was Gran's specialty. The hinges didn't even creak. a small magical courtesy that nonetheless spoke volumes about her grandmother's attention to detail. Kristin barely had time to register her grandmother's knowing smirk before the older woman let out an exaggerated sigh. Despite being well into her 70s, Gran showed no signs of slowing down. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, her posture remained impeccable, and the spark in her eyes was as mischievous as ever. "How many times do I have to tell you that you can just walk in?" she asked, her tone mock-exasperated, but her eyes warm with genuine pleasure at seeing them. Family doesn't knock. 5 years had softened many of the formalities between them. Gran had gone from being primarily Kristin's mentor to becoming a true matriarch to both of them, embracing Daniel with a generosity that had surprised everyone, perhaps even Gran herself. Kristin chuckled, shaking her head. "We were trying to be polite." "Politeness," her grandmother declared, "is overrated when it delays getting inside where there's fresh cider and those maple cookies Daniel pretends not to be addicted to." "I maintain they're just reasonably enjoyable," Daniel protested with feigned dignity, though his expression brightened noticeably at the mention of the treats. Her grandmother snorted, the sound incongruously undignified coming from someone who normally carried herself with such elegant poise. But then her gaze flickered between the two of them, her smirk widening into something entirely too smug, too knowing, the look that had preceded many of her most startling revelations over the years. Kristin felt her pulse quicken. No way. She couldn't possibly know. They'd been so careful, taken every precaution, and then, "Now the 4 of you get inside before you catch a death of cold." The casual statement, delivered as Gran turned to lead them into the house, landed like a thunderclap. Kristin and Daniel both froze on the threshold, momentarily paralyzed by the implications of what they'd just heard. Their eyes widened in perfect sync as her grandmother turned on her heel and strolled inside like she hadn't just said something completely impossible, completely unexpected. Something that shattered all their careful planning for how this visit would unfold. Kristin instinctively placed a hand over her stomach, her heart racing. The soft cashmere of her sweater felt suddenly inadequate protection for what lay beneath, what apparently couldn't be hidden from her grandmother's extraordinary perception. Daniel was just as stunned, his grip on her hand tightening slightly, his expression cycling rapidly between shock, confusion, and a dawning wonder that mirrored her own internal response. "Did she just—" he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She did," Kristin confirmed, equally quiet. "But how could she possibly, 4 of us?" The implications were clear, undeniable, and completely unexpected. They'd known about the pregnancy for 3 weeks. Confirmed first by Kristin's intuition, then by a specialized magical detection spell, finally by a very ordinary drugstore test that had left them both staring in wonder at the 2 pink lines. But twins. That was information even they didn't have yet. They'd been waiting for the first ultrasound appointment next week before telling family, wanting to have all the details before making any announcements. No one, not even Daniel's parents, who were powerful in their own right and had been dropping unsubtle hints about grandchildren since the wedding, had sensed it yet. The Carter family magic, while exceptional at business foresight and financial prophecy, wasn't typically attuned to such intimate biological developments. How the hell had her grandmother known? They hadn't even told her about the pregnancy, let alone the possibility of twins. The concealment charms they'd crafted should have masked even the subtle magical signature that developed around a witch during pregnancy. The protective spells they'd maintained should have prevented any outside magical examination. However well-intentioned. "She's bluffing," Daniel suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Testing us to see our reaction." "No." But even as he said it, they both knew it wasn't true. Gran didn't operate that way. Her methods might be dramatic, her timing theatrical, but her magical insights were never guesswork or manipulation. Kristin swallowed hard, exchanging a look with Daniel that conveyed volumes without a single word spoken. 5 years of marriage, of magical partnership, of building a life together had given them a shorthand that transcended ordinary communication. They didn't need to say anything. The slight widening of his eyes, the almost imperceptible nod, the quick squeeze of his hand around hers. They were both thinking the same exact thing. Just how powerful was her grandmother? To detect not only the pregnancy they'd so carefully concealed, but also the presence of twins before modern medicine had confirmed it. It suggested a level of magical perception far beyond what they'd attributed to her, despite knowing she was exceptionally talented. "I can hear you two thinking from in here," Gran called from the living room, her voice carrying a distinct note of amusement. "The cider's getting cold, and these babies won't discuss themselves." Still speechless, they followed her inside, determined to get answers. The familiar interior of the Victorian home enveloped them, the soft lighting, the subtle scent of herbs and spices, the comfortable furnishings that had witnessed so many important moments in their lives. As they entered the living room, they found Gran already settled in her favorite armchair, a tea service arranged on the coffee table along with a plate of the infamous maple cookies. 2 mugs had been poured, 1 standard black tea for Daniel, and 1 herbal blend that Kristin suddenly realized was a traditional pregnancy support tonic her grandmother had mentioned in passing years ago. "Well," Gran prompted, gesturing for them to sit, "aren't you going to ask me how I knew? Or would you prefer to start with names? I have opinions, of course, but I promise to keep them to myself." She paused, her eyes twinkling. "At least until the 2nd trimester." As they settled onto the couch, still slightly dazed, but recovering their equilibrium, Kristin couldn't help but think that some things never changed. No matter how much their world had transformed, no matter how powerful they'd become individually and together, Gran would always be 1 step ahead, watching their journey with that knowing smile and dropping revelations that left them speechless. And somehow, that consistency was exactly what they needed as they prepared to embark on the next chapter of their extraordinary life together.